5 months pregnant and still grieving her husband, Amelia Bennett was abandoned in the mountains with no food, no rifle, and no shelter, only $11 hidden in her boot and her grandfather's old knife. The men who left her believed that the pregnant widow would never survive. They were wrong, because deep inside an unmapped ravine, Amelia discovered a hidden cabin, and beneath its stone hearth, something that would change her unborn child's future forever. Stay until the end. Subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Amelia Bennett was 26 years old, 5 months pregnant, and still wearing her dead husband's wedding ring when 4 men abandoned her in the mountains above Silver Creek. They left her where the trail disappeared into a narrow ravine, miles from the nearest settlement. No horse, no rifle, no food, and no one who knew where to look for her. Beneath a borrowed wool coat, Amelia pressed one trembling hand against the small curve of her belly. Her baby moved. That tiny movement was the only answer she received from the wilderness. In her boot were $11. At her hip hung an old, bone-handled folding knife that had belonged to her grandfather. Samuel Bennett, a former Army scout who had raised Amelia after she lost her parents as a child. Those men believed they had abandoned a grieving widow who would never survive the coming cold. They were wrong. Samuel had taught Amelia how to read clouds before a storm, find water beneath frozen ground, build fire from damp timber, and navigate mountains without a compass. But even Samuel could never have prepared her for what she was about to discover. Because less than half a day's walk east, hidden inside a ravine that appeared on no map, stood an abandoned cabin, and beneath its stone hearth waited something that had been buried for more than 20 years. Something connected to Samuel. Something that would change Amelia's life and the life of her unborn child forever. To understand how Amelia Bennett came to stand alone in those mountains, 5 months pregnant, abandoned, and miles from anyone who might hear her scream, you have to understand something first. Those men were not the first people to leave her. They were simply the first who had chosen to. Loss had been following Amelia for most of her life. She was only 8 years old when a merciless winter fever swept through the lumber camps outside Silver Creek and took her father. She still remembered waiting beside the window for him. Her mother had told her he would come home. He never did. Less than 2 years later, grief seemed to take her mother too. And so, before Amelia was old enough to understand why the people she loved kept disappearing, she was sent to live with her grandfather, Samuel Bennett, on an isolated 80-acre homestead beneath the western mountains. Samuel was 64 then, a widower and former Army scout with weathered hands, a quiet voice, and eyes that seemed to notice everything. He did not know how to raise a frightened little girl. When Amelia cried at night for her mother, Samuel never told her everything would be all right. Perhaps he knew better than to make promises life might not keep. Instead, he taught her how to endure the days when nothing was all right. He taught her how to split a rain-soaked branch and find dry wood at its heart, how to read an approaching storm in the clouds, how to cross loose shale without losing her footing, how to find water, how to build shelter, how to listen to the mountains, and most importantly, how not to panic when she was afraid. By 16, Amelia could pack a mule, dress an elk, start a fire in bad weather, and find her way home through country where grown men sometimes became lost. On her 17th birthday, Samuel placed an old folding knife in her hand. Its bone handle had been worn smooth by decades of use. "Keep it close," he told her. Amelia smiled. "Why?" Samuel closed her fingers around it. "Because the world can take a great many things from you. But a person who knows what to do with their own 2 hands is never completely helpless." Years later, Amelia would remember every word. But first, life gave her something beautiful. His name was Nathan Cole. Nathan was a young carpenter with gentle hands and an easy laugh. Where Samuel had taught Amelia how to survive, Nathan taught her that surviving was not the same as living. He danced with her in the kitchen when there was no music. He warmed her side of the bed on winter nights. And he promised that one day he would build them a little house with a wide porch facing west. 2 rocking chairs. Nathan always said. Amelia would tease him. Only 2. Nathan would smile. We'll add smaller ones when we need them. Then Amelia discovered she was pregnant. When she told him, Nathan simply stared at her. For one frightening second, she thought something was wrong. Then he dropped to his knees. He placed both hands against her still flat stomach and pressed his forehead gently against her dress. And he cried. Amelia cried with him. For 3 weeks, they carried the happiest secret of their lives. 3 weeks. That was all they were given. Nathan was hauling timber down a steep mountain road when a logging wagon overturned. 2 men brought him home before sunset. Amelia knew before they spoke. She knew from the way neither man would look into her eyes. Nathan never got to see her belly grow. He never felt his child kick. He never built the porch. Amelia buried her husband while carrying the last living piece of him beneath her heart. She was 26 years old, 5 months pregnant, and a widow. By then, Samuel was gone too. He had died quietly the previous spring, leaving behind his cabin, his land, and a silence Amelia still sometimes mistook for peace. Then came the letter. Samuel's 80-acre homestead had legally passed to his surviving brother, Caleb Bennett. Caleb intended to sell it. Amelia could remain until the sale closed. After that, she had to leave. She read the letter twice at Samuel's old kitchen table. One hand slowly moved to her stomach. Across from her stood Samuel's empty chair. Near the doorway hung the peg where Nathan used to leave his coat. For a moment, Amelia could almost hear them. Samuel sharpening his knife, Nathan laughing from the porch. Her mother calling her name from a lifetime ago. Then the baby moved inside her. And Amelia finally cried. Not loudly. There was no one left in the house to hear her. She simply lowered her head onto the table and wept, until the letter beneath her hand was wet. One by one, life had taken her father, her mother, her grandfather, her husband, and now it wanted the last place where their memories still lived. When the tears stopped, Amelia folded the letter carefully. Then she stood up and went outside to feed the chickens, because grief did not stop living things from getting hungry, and a broken heart did not stop a child from growing. 2 weeks later, a land agent arrived and informed her that the livestock, furniture, mule, and even Samuel's rifle belonged to the property sale. Amelia was permitted to keep her clothes, her mother's Bible, 1 blanket, an iron skillet, Samuel's oversized wool coat, and the bone-handled folding knife. That was nearly everything left of her life. On her final night, Amelia slept on the bare wooden floor beside the cold stove. The house sounded different without furniture. Empty rooms always do. Samuel's knife rested beside her hand. Nathan's wedding ring remained on her finger. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a small movement beneath her ribs. The baby kicked. Amelia froze. Then another kick came. She placed both hands over her belly. For a long time, she said nothing. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the home she would have to leave when morning came. "I'm scared," she finally whispered. The admission broke something inside her. Tears slipped silently into her hair. "I don't know where we're going." Her hand moved slowly across the curve of her stomach. "I don't know how I'm going to do this without your father." She closed her eyes. Then she remembered Samuel's hands closing hers around that old knife. The world can take a great many things from you. Amelia drew a trembling breath. "But I promise you something." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I may have lost everyone who was supposed to protect me, but you haven't." She pressed her palm against the place where her child had moved. "You still have me." The next morning, Amelia Bennett walked away from the last home she had left. $11 were hidden inside her boot. Her belongings were tied into a bundle over her shoulder. Samuel's knife rested against her hip. Nathan's ring remained on her finger, and beneath an oversized wool coat, the child Nathan would never meet moved gently inside her. Amelia reached the end of the path. For the first time, she stopped. She looked back at the cabin, at the chimney, at Samuel's porch, at the doorway Nathan had walked through so many times. She wanted desperately to turn around, but there was nothing left to turn back to. So Amelia placed one hand over her unborn child and kept walking. She did not know it yet, but the mountains ahead were about to strip away almost everything she had left. And when they did, Amelia would discover whether Samuel had been right all those years ago. Whether a person who had lost nearly everything could still refuse to become helpless. Amelia Bennett reached Silver Creek near sundown with $11 hidden in her boot, Samuel's knife at her hip, and nowhere in the world that was waiting for her. The town was little more than one dusty street lined with hitching posts, a boarding house, a mercantile, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of buildings whose windows glowed yellow after dark. Amelia asked for work everywhere. At the boarding house, at the laundry, at the hotel, even at the kitchen behind the saloon. Each answer was nearly the same. They saw the Black Widow's dress first. Then they noticed her belly. Their expressions changed. Work gets hard around here. You shouldn't be lifting things. We need someone who can last through winter. Some tried to sound kind. That almost hurt more. By her third morning, Amelia had begun counting every penny before she spent it. Then she heard that 4 hunters were heading into the high country and needed someone who knew the mountain drainages. The man leading them was named Everett Rourke. When Amelia approached him behind the freight office, his eyes immediately dropped toward her stomach. "You're expecting 5 months, and you want to go into the mountains. I grew up in them." Everett almost laughed. Amelia didn't. "I can cook, pack a mule, dress game, read weather, find water, and I know the country above Silver Creek better than most men who claim they do." Something in her voice made his smile disappear. He offered her $4 for the trip, plus meals. $4. It was not much, but Amelia thought of flour, blankets, medicine, a cradle Nathan would never get to build. "I'll take it." They rode out the following morning. For 4 days, Amelia worked without complaint. She cooked their meals, tended the horses, secured the packs, gathered firewood, and slept a short distance from the men with Samuel's folding knife beneath her blanket. At night, when no one was watching, she rested both hands over her belly. Sometimes the baby moved. Whenever it did, Amelia smiled despite herself. "You're still with me," she whispered. On the 4th morning, Everett unfolded a rough, hand-drawn map. He pointed toward a drainage beyond a long ridge. "Right ahead. Check for Bighorn sign." Amelia studied the map. Something about it felt wrong, but she needed the $4. More than that, she needed these men to believe a pregnant widow could finish the job she had been hired to do. So she mounted the bay gelding and rode north. For nearly 2 hours, she searched the drainage. There were no sheep, no tracks, no droppings. Nothing? Only rock, wind, and a terrible emptiness. By the time Amelia turned back, clouds had begun gathering over the peaks. She expected to smell campfire smoke before she reached the others. She smelled nothing. Then she reached the camp and stopped. The tents were gone. The pack animals were gone. Her bundle was gone. Her blanket. Her food. Her mother's Bible. Everything. Gone. Everett. Only the wind answered. Amelia slid from the saddle. For several seconds, she simply stood there. Then she saw the tracks. 4 horses. The pack animals, all heading south. Away from her. Amelia stared at them until the truth became impossible to deny. They had not gotten lost. They had not moved camp. they had left her. Deliberately. Her breathing changed. No. One hand went instinctively to her stomach. No, no, no. For the first time since Nathan's death, real panic seized her. She looked around at the empty mountains. Miles of wilderness surrounded her. No food, no rifle, no shelter, and no one in Silver Creek knew exactly where Everett had taken her. Then the baby moved. A small kick beneath her palm. Amelia went completely still. Another movement followed. She lowered her head. And suddenly she was crying. Not because she was afraid to die, because she was terrified her child might die with her. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her knees weakened, and she sank beside the horse. I'm so sorry. She thought of Nathan kneeling before her when she told him about the baby. She remembered the tears in his eyes, the way he had whispered, "We're going to be a family." Nathan was gone. Samuel was gone. There was no one coming. For one terrible moment, Amelia wanted to lie down in the grass and let someone else decide what happened next. Then Samuel's voice returned from somewhere deep in her memory. Don't panic when you're lost. Stop. Look. Think. Amelia wiped her face. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Then she studied the mountains. South meant following Everett. East meant older country she had crossed with Samuel years before. She remembered a spring, a narrow ravine, timbered slopes, possibly shelter. Amelia touched Samuel's knife. Then she touched her stomach. All right, she whispered. You and me. She turned the gelding east. Near sunset, the horse threw a shoe crossing a slope of broken shale. Within an hour, he was badly lame. Amelia knew what had to be done. She removed the saddle and bridle, stroked the gelding's neck, and turned him loose. Then she began walking. Every mile became harder. Her back ached. Her feet blistered. Hunger twisted through her stomach. Whenever pain tightened across her belly, terror followed immediately. But she kept moving. Through sunset, through darkness, through the bitter mountain wind. At dawn, Amelia crawled beneath a fallen fir and slept for less than 2 hours. When she woke, her first thought was not of herself. Her hand flew to her belly. Nothing. Baby! Silence. Her heart began pounding. Please. Then, a faint movement. Amelia closed her eyes. A broken laugh escaped through her tears. There you are. She pressed her forehead against her hands. Then she stood again. Near noon, exhausted and trembling, Amelia followed a narrow game trail down between 2 walls of stone. The trail opened into a hidden ravine. There, beside a clear spring, stood something that made her stop breathing. A cabin. Old, silent, abandoned. Its roof had gone silver with age, and pine needles covered the threshold as though no human foot had crossed it in years. Amelia stared at it. Hours earlier, she had believed the mountains contained nothing but the possibility of death. Now, in a ravine, no map had shown her. There was a door. She placed one hand over her unborn child. Then she walked toward it. Amelia did not know who had built that cabin. She did not know why it had been abandoned. And she could not possibly know that beneath the stones of its hearth lay something that had been waiting more than 20 years for someone exactly like her to arrive. But before Amelia touched the door, the baby kicked once beneath her heart. And for the first time since those hoofprints disappeared south, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they were not going to die after all. Amelia stood before the cabin for several seconds without touching the door. After everything she had lost, hope had become something she no longer trusted easily. But the baby moved beneath her coat. That was enough. She pushed the door open. The hinges answered with a long, tired groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old pine, and years of silence. There was a stone hearth against one wall, a small cast-iron stove, a rough plank table, a single stool, and a rope bed frame without a mattress. It was not much. To Amelia, it looked like mercy. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. For the first time since discovering the empty camp, there were walls around her, a roof above her child. She covered her face with both hands and cried, not the desperate tears she had shed on the mountain. These were different. These were the tears of someone who had prepared herself to die and had suddenly been given one more night to live. "Thank you," she whispered. She did not know who she was thanking. God, Samuel, Nathan, perhaps the mountain itself. Amelia forced herself back to work. Samuel had taught her that gratitude could wait until after survival. She found a spring outside, drank slowly, then carried water back in an old tin cup. She gathered dry twigs and pine cones and coaxed a fire into the stove. Samuel had carved them into tools, saddles, boxes, everything he expected to keep. Her grandfather's compass was lying in a hidden compartment inside a cabin he had never once mentioned. Her hands began trembling. Suddenly, the gold meant nothing. The money disappeared from her thoughts. There was only the compass, Samuel, and a question. How did you get here? Amelia pressed the compass against her chest. For the first time since Samuel died, she felt something she had believed was gone forever. Not his presence exactly. Something quieter. A connection. A thread stretching backward through years she did not understand. She looked at the ledger. At Elias Mercer's name. At Samuel's knife beside the scattered gold. At the compass in her hand. Then her baby moved. Amelia lowered her eyes toward her belly. 3 generations seemed to meet in that tiny room. The grandfather who had taught her how to survive. The granddaughter he had left behind. And the child he would never meet. Amelia began to cry again. But this time, she smiled through the tears. All her life, she had believed survival meant holding tightly to whatever remained after something was taken from you. That night, she understood something different. Sometimes survival meant continuing long enough to discover that what you thought was lost had simply taken another road back to you. Amelia carefully gathered the gold. She returned everything to the hidden compartment. Everything except the compass, that she slipped inside Samuel's wool coat, close to her heart. Then she lay beside the stove with one hand over her unborn child. That morning, Amelia had awakened believing she possessed almost nothing. $11, a knife, a dead husband's ring, and a child she was terrified she could not protect. By nightfall, none of those things had changed. But Amelia had. For the first time since Nathan died, she stopped asking herself how long she could survive. Instead, she asked a question she had almost forgotten how to ask. What if we can actually live? Outside, darkness settled over the hidden ravine. Inside, the fire burned steadily. And beneath Amelia's hand, her baby kicked. This time, Amelia smiled. Because the abandoned widow who had entered that cabin expecting nothing more than shelter was beginning to understand. Perhaps this mountain had not become the place where her story ended. Perhaps it was the place where her child's story and her own could finally begin. Morning came quietly to the hidden ravine. Amelia woke beside the dying stove, with one hand resting over her belly and the other curled around Samuel's brass compass. For several seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then she saw the rough log walls, the plank table, the old hearth, and everything returned. Everett, the empty camp, the long walk through darkness, the cabin, Samuel's compass. Amelia slowly sat up. Her body hurt everywhere. Her feet were blistered, her back ached, and hunger had left her weak enough that standing required both hands against the wall. But she was alive. More importantly, her child was alive. A soft movement beneath her ribs confirmed it. "Good morning," Amelia whispered. For the first time in months, those words did not feel empty. She looked around the cabin again. Yesterday, it had been shelter. Today, she saw something else. Possibility. Amelia spent the next several days doing what Samuel had taught her to do whenever circumstances became overwhelming. She worked on the next necessary thing. Nothing more. She swept years of dust from the floor. She cleared old ash from the stove and repaired the damper. She filled gaps between the logs with fresh clay from the spring bank. She restrung the rope bed and gathered dry grass to make something soft enough to sleep on. Each task was small, but with every repaired hinge, every armful of wood, every crack she sealed against the coming cold, the abandoned cabin became less like a grave forgotten by the world, and more like a home. Sometimes Amelia caught herself imagining a cradle beside the stove. That frightened her. Hope still frightened her, because every time she had loved something, life had found a way to take it. But one evening, as she sat at the table with Samuel's compass in front of her, the baby kicked hard enough to make her laugh. The sound surprised her. Amelia had not heard herself laugh since Nathan died. She covered her mouth. Then the laughter became tears. "Oh, your father would have loved you," she whispered. She closed her eyes and pictured Nathan kneeling before her, his forehead against her stomach. 2 rocking chairs. He had promised, "We'll add smaller ones when we need them." Amelia looked around the cabin. "No porch," she said softly. "But maybe we can start here." On the 6th morning, Amelia opened the hidden compartment beneath the hearth. She did not take everything. Only 4 gold coins. Enough to begin. She placed them inside her boot beside the $11 she had carried into the mountains. Then she tucked Samuel's compass inside her coat and began the journey back to Silver Creek. When Amelia walked into town that afternoon, people stared. They had heard that Everett Rourke's hunting party had returned without her. Some had assumed she was still somewhere in the mountains. Others had assumed something worse. Amelia did not stop to explain herself. She walked directly to the marshal's office. Marshal Owen Hale was a 53-year-old widower with gray at his temples and the habit of listening without interrupting. Amelia told him everything. Everett sending her alone into an empty drainage. The camp disappearing. The tracks leading south. Her belongings being taken. Owen's expression hardened. "You're certain they left you intentionally?" Amelia looked directly at him. "They took my blanket, my food, and my Bible." Her hand moved over her stomach. They knew exactly what they were leaving behind. The marshal closed his notebook. "I'll find them." Amelia nodded. Then she did something even more important. She went to the land office. The clerk examined the records and confirmed what Amelia had hoped. The ravine had never been formally claimed. No patent. No registered owner. No existing homestead filing. Amelia placed the filing fee on his desk. "I want it." The clerk looked up. "The whole bench. And the ravine." He glanced at her worn clothes, her swollen feet, and the unmistakable curve beneath Samuel's coat. "You planning to live up there?" Amelia thought about the cabin. The stove. The spring. The place beside the wall where a cradle might fit. "Yes." The word came without hesitation. "I am—" From there, she went to the mercantile. 1 gold coin became flour, salt, coffee, lard, matches, another wool blanket, a small axe, ammunition, and a used single-shot rifle. And then Amelia saw something hanging from a ceiling beam. A wooden cradle. It was plain pine, unfinished and inexpensive. Amelia stopped walking. The shopkeeper noticed. "You need that." She touched the wedding ring on her finger. Nathan had been supposed to build one. For several seconds, Amelia could not answer. Then she shook her head. Not today. She bought a small handsaw instead. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. Amelia gave him the first real smile she had offered a stranger in months. "I'm going to make my own." By evening, word had spread through Silver Creek. The pregnant widow everyone had assumed was dead had walked back into town. She had reported the men who abandoned her. She had filed a claim on forgotten mountain land, and she was returning there willingly. But something else happened, too. People began remembering Samuel Bennett. An elderly woman who had known Amelia's mother brought her 2 dresses and a stack of clean cloth that could someday become diapers. The blacksmith offered to shoe a mule without charge. A freighter who remembered Samuel agreed to carry supplies to the trailhead for half his usual price. And the woman at the boarding house, the same woman who had once told Amelia there was no work for her, quietly handed her a paper parcel. Inside were biscuits, cold chicken, and 2 apples. "For the road," she said. Amelia looked at her. Then at the food. "Thank you." That was all. But walking back toward the livery, Amelia began to understand something she had not understood when she first entered Silver Creek. She had believed she was alone because the people she loved were dead. But perhaps being alone and having no one were not the same thing. 9 days later, Marshal Owen Hale returned. Everett Rourke and 2 of his companions rode behind him with their wrists tied to their saddles. And tied behind Owen's horse was Amelia's old bundle, her clothes, her iron skillet, and her mother's Bible. Owen handed the Bible to her personally. Amelia ran her fingers over its worn cover. For a moment, she could not speak. Then she pressed it against her heart. She did not look at Everett. She did not need to. The man who had left her in the mountains no longer had any power over the direction of her life. Before the first snow, Amelia returned permanently to the ravine. She stacked firewood against the cabin wall, stored flour and salt on the shelves, prepared the rope bed, and beside the stove, using the little hand saw she had bought in Silver Creek, she began shaping pieces of pine. Her cuts were imperfect. Nathan's would have been better. She knew that. But night after night, Amelia worked, until finally, beside the same stove that had warmed her when she believed she might die, stood a small wooden cradle. Amelia ran her hand along its rough edge. Then she sat down and cried, not because Nathan had failed to build it, but because she finally understood what she was building in his place. Not wealth, not revenge, not even a cabin. A future. The men who abandoned Amelia had believed they were taking away her last chance to survive. Instead, without knowing it, they had driven her toward the first piece of land she could truly call her own. A place where Samuel's compass had waited for decades. A place where Nathan's child could be born beneath a roof. No one could order them to leave. That night, Amelia placed one hand on the unfinished cradle and the other over her belly. "We have a home," she whispered. "The baby moved," and Amelia smiled through her tears. For the first time since Nathan died, she was no longer trying to find somewhere to go. She had arrived. Winter came early to the mountains above Silver Creek. By the first week of November, snow had buried the trail leading into Amelia's ravine, and the pines stood beneath heavy white branches that groaned whenever the wind moved through them. But inside the cabin, the stove burned steadily. There was flour on the shelf, firewood stacked beneath the eaves, a rifle beside the door, and near the stove stood the little pine cradle Amelia had built with her own hands. It was crooked in places. One runner sat slightly higher than the other. Nathan would have noticed immediately. Sometimes Amelia imagined him kneeling beside it with that familiar smile. "You measured this twice." She would look at the cradle and almost hear herself answer, "No." And in those moments, she smiled. Grief had not disappeared. Amelia was beginning to understand that perhaps it never did. It simply changed shape. Some days, Nathan's memory was a knife. Other days, it was a hand on her shoulder. As her belly grew heavier, life in the ravine became harder. Carrying wood exhausted her. Bending to fill the stove made her back ache. Some nights she woke frightened by pains she did not understand and lay completely still, waiting desperately for the baby to move. Then, a kick. Amelia would exhale. There you are. Those 3 words became her nightly prayer. By December, Amelia no longer thought of herself as the woman Everett Rourke had abandoned. That woman had entered the ravine terrified she could not protect her child. The woman living there now had repaired a cabin, claimed land, faced the men who betrayed her, prepared for winter, and built a cradle. She had stopped measuring her strength by what she had lost. She measured it by what she could still build. Then, on a bitter January night, the pains began. Amelia knew immediately. The baby was coming! Too soon for comfort, and the mountain was buried beneath snow. For one terrible hour, the old fear returned. She was alone. Nathan was dead. Samuel was dead. No doctor could reach her before morning. Amelia gripped the edge of the table as another contraction tore through her. Not yet. She gasped. Then came a knock at the door. Amelia froze. Another knock. Amelia. It was a woman's voice. Amelia opened the door and found Eleanor Price, the 70-year-old widow who had known Amelia's mother, standing in the snow beside Marshal Owen Hale. Behind them was a mule carrying blankets and supplies. Eleanor stepped inside. I had a feeling that baby wasn't going to wait for spring. Amelia stared at her. You came all this way? The older woman removed her gloves. Your mother once walked 3 miles through a thunderstorm when I was sick. She looked at Amelia's frightened face. Some debts aren't paid with money. Hours later, Amelia lay exhausted on the rope bed while Eleanor worked beside her. The wind screamed outside. The fire cracked in the stove. Amelia cried for Nathan. She cried for her mother. Once, during the worst of the pain, she cried for Samuel. I can't do this. Eleanor took her hand. Yes, you can. I'm scared. I know. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut. I want my husband. Eleanor's expression softened. I know that too. Those words broke Amelia more deeply than reassurance could have. She sobbed. Then another contraction came, and Amelia pushed. Just before dawn, a cry filled the cabin. Small, angry, alive. Amelia stopped breathing. Eleanor wrapped the child in a clean blanket and placed him against Amelia's chest. A boy. Amelia stared down at him. Tiny fingers. Dark hair. Nathan's mouth. Oh, that was all she could say. The baby opened his eyes. Amelia touched his cheek with one trembling finger. Hello, Samuel Nathan Cole. She had chosen both names months earlier. One for the man who taught her how to survive. One for the man who taught her why life was worth surviving. Amelia held her son and wept until there seemed to be no tears left. You made it, she whispered. Then she kissed his forehead. We made it. Spring changed everything. When the snow melted, Amelia rode into Silver Creek with Samuel Nathan bundled against her chest. People came out to see them. The same town that had once looked at Amelia and seen a pregnant widow with nowhere to go now saw something different. They saw the woman who had survived the high country, the woman who owned the hidden ravine, the woman who had spent a winter alone in the mountains and returned carrying a healthy baby. But Amelia did not need their admiration anymore. That was another way she had changed. She had spent too much of her life believing safety came from being allowed to stay somewhere. Now she knew better. Safety came from knowing she could stand on her own ground. As Samuel Nathan grew, Amelia began guiding hunters through the surrounding mountains. At first, some men hesitated. A woman guide. Amelia never argued. She simply charged $4 a day, the same amount Everett Rourke had once offered her. Then she led those men into country they could never have navigated alone. She found elk where they saw empty hills. She predicted storms before clouds crossed the ridge. She brought every client home. Soon, men arriving in Silver Creek began asking for Amelia Bennett by name. And something remarkable happened. Men who once barely noticed her now removed their hats when she passed. Not because she had discovered gold. They did not know about the gold. They respected her because she had become impossible to dismiss. Year by year, Amelia improved the cabin. She built a shed, fenced a small pasture, bought 2 cows, planted potatoes and beans near the spring, and eventually she added a porch. It faced west. One evening, when Samuel Nathan was old enough to walk, Amelia carried 2 rocking chairs onto it. One large, one small. She sat in the larger chair while her son climbed into the smaller one. The sunset burned orange behind the mountains. Samuel Nathan looked up at her. "Mama." "Yes." "Why are you crying?" Amelia touched Nathan's wedding ring, which she still wore. Then she looked at the empty space beside her chair. For years, that empty space would have broken her heart. Now it reminded her that love could remain even when a person could not. She wiped her tears and smiled at her son. "Because your father once promised me this porch." The boy looked around. "But you built it." Amelia's breath caught. Then she pulled him into her arms. "Yes," she whispered. "I suppose I did." And there, beneath the evening sky, Amelia finally understood the woman she had become. She had once believed strength meant never falling apart. It did not. Strength was crying and still feeding the chickens, being terrified and still taking another step, missing someone every day and still allowing yourself to love tomorrow. Amelia had not stopped being the widow Nathan left behind. She had become something more: a mother, a landowner, a guide, a woman with a home no one could take from her. And when Samuel Nathan fell asleep against her shoulder, Amelia looked towards the mountains that had once nearly killed them both. She no longer saw the place where she had been abandoned. She saw the place where she had learned that being left behind did not mean your life had to stay behind with those who left you. 4 years passed. The cabin in the hidden ravine no longer looked abandoned. Smoke curled from its chimney on winter mornings. A sturdy shed stood against the southern wall. A fence crossed the meadow, and in summer, beans climbed poles beside the spring. And facing west stood the porch Nathan had once dreamed of. Amelia had built it herself. One quiet autumn evening, Samuel Nathan fell asleep early after spending the afternoon following his mother through the meadow. Amelia carried him to bed, pulled the blanket beneath his chin, and stood there for a moment watching him breathe. He had Nathan's mouth. Sometimes that still hurt, but it was a beautiful kind of hurt now. Amelia kissed his forehead and returned to the kitchen. Outside, the mountains were disappearing into darkness. Inside, a kerosene lamp burned on the old plank table. Amelia opened Elias Mercer's leather ledger. There was one thing she had kept all these years but rarely touched: the sealed letter. That night, she opened it again. The paper had grown soft along the folds. Elias wrote that during the war, he had served as a quartermaster's clerk. In 1864, he had been ordered to hide military funds and supplies in the mountains before a movement that never came. The war ended. No one returned for them. Years passed. Elias remained. He added his own trapping money to what had been left behind, knowing he had no wife, no children, and no family who would ever inherit it. Then Amelia reached the passage that always made her hands tremble. Elias wrote of a young army scout, Samuel Bennett. Amelia stopped reading. Her grandfather's name sat before her in faded brown ink. According to Elias, Samuel had entrusted him with a brass compass during a dangerous river crossing in 1864. Samuel intended to return for it. He never did. Elias kept it. For more than 20 years, he waited for an opportunity to return it to the man who owned it. That opportunity never came. So before his death, Elias placed the compass with everything else beneath the hearth. His final words were simple. He asked that whoever found the cabin, if that person was truly in need, use what remained there to build a life. Amelia lowered the letter. For a long time, she listened to the fire. Then she reached into her pocket and removed Samuel's compass. She placed it on the table. Beside it, she laid the bone-handled folding knife he had given her on her 17th birthday. 2 objects. 2 journeys. One had reached her directly through Samuel's hand. The other had traveled through war, wilderness, and the keeping of a lonely stranger for decades before finding its way back to his granddaughter. Amelia ran her finger across the initials. "So, B." Her eyes filled with tears. "You found your way home," she whispered. Then she realized something. So had she. The night Everett Rourke abandoned her, Amelia had believed she was being erased. A pregnant widow. No home. No family beside her. No rifle. No food. $11 hidden inside her boot. The men who rode away probably believed the mountains would finish what life had already started. But they had misunderstood her. And they had misunderstood the mountains. They thought they had left Amelia in empty country. They had actually left her in Samuel's country. Elias's country. And eventually her own. The place meant to become her grave had become the ground beneath her home. The child she feared would die. There was sleeping safely in the next room. The widow who had begged the darkness for one more morning now guided men through those same mountains for a living. And the woman who had once been told she had no right to remain in her grandfather's house now possessed land with her own name written on the patent. Amelia looked toward Samuel Nathan's bedroom. The gold beneath the hearth had helped. She would never pretend otherwise. It bought food, tools, a rifle, supplies, time. But gold had not carried her through the mountains. Gold had not told her which direction to walk. Gold had not taught her how to make fire from wet timber. Gold had not made her stand after Everett abandoned her. Those things had been given to her long before she ever saw a single coin. Samuel had given them to her. Nathan had given her something too, a reason to imagine tomorrow. And even Elias Mercer, a stranger who died before Amelia was old enough to remember, had given her one final chance, simply because he believed that someday a person in need might find his door. Amelia suddenly understood how a life could be saved by people who would never know they had saved it. A lesson taught to a child. A compass kept for a friend. A cabin left standing. A little kindness remembered 20 years later. None of them seemed like miracles when they happened. But together, they had become one. A floorboard creaked behind her. Amelia turned. Samuel Nathan stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mama." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I couldn't sleep." He climbed onto her lap and noticed the objects on the table. He pointed toward the knife. "Grandpa Samuel's." "Yes." Then he touched the compass carefully. "And that?" Amelia looked down at her son. "That belonged to him, too." Samuel Nathan frowned. "Then why do you have it?" Amelia smiled through her tears. "Because someone kept it safe until it could find its way back." The boy considered this with the seriousness only a child could give such an answer. Then he leaned against her chest. Amelia wrapped her arms around him. Outside, the same wind that had once cut through her borrowed coat moved softly through the pines. But Amelia was no longer afraid of its sound. She had spent years believing life was defined by what it took away. Her parents, Samuel, Nathan, her home, her security, her certainty. Now she knew life could also be measured by what remained. What was passed down, what strangers protected, what love built after grief had finished breaking everything it could. Amelia kissed her son's hair. Then she looked at the knife and compass resting side by side beneath the lamplight. Once, she had walked into that ravine carrying almost nothing. Now she understood she had never truly arrived empty-handed. She had carried Samuel's lessons, Nathan's love, her unborn child, and a strength she did not yet know belonged to her. Sometimes losing the road you planned to travel does not mean your journey is over. Sometimes it simply means you are about to discover the road that was waiting for you all along. And sometimes the place where the world leaves you behind becomes the very place where you finally find your way home. Amelia's story reminds us that life can take away almost everything we thought would always be there. A home, a dream, a person we love, even the future we once believed was certain. But there are things no one can take from us. The lessons we were given, the love we received, the courage hidden inside us, and the strength to take one more step when everything tells us to stop. Amelia entered those mountains as a grieving widow, 5 months pregnant, with $11 in her boot and almost nowhere left to turn. But she walked out carrying something more valuable than the gold she discovered. She carried the realization that her life was not over. And maybe someone watching tonight needs that reminder too. If Amelia's journey touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who may need to hear it today. And before you leave, I want you to do one more thing. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and write the name of someone who taught you how to keep going when life became difficult. Let their name be remembered here, because sometimes the greatest inheritance someone leaves us isn't money or property, it is the strength they placed inside us. And if you are going through a difficult chapter right now, remember Amelia. A road ending does not mean your story is over. Sometimes it is exactly where a new life begins.